So how does the despair of weakness become the despair of defiance? How does the despair of not wanting to be oneself become the despair of wanting to be oneself? Well, the last section, the long section describing this despair of passivity or weakness, of the despair of not wanting to be oneself, also gradually told the story of coming to know oneself more. That is, the self becomes more of itself as it becomes more self-conscious, and becomes more conscious over what Kierkegaard calls the eternal in oneself. Becomes aware that it is not, the self is not its externals, it's not its body, it's not its possessions, it's not its social status, it's not its any of these things, that there is something, there's a deeper level of the self. And the last form of this despair of not wanting to be oneself showed a degree of awareness of that internal authentic self, maybe in terms of guilt, or being aware of one's own weakness and being disgusted with oneself and wanting to be a different self, and of course this being despairing because you can't be a different self. Somehow this sort of experience, as we gradually become more aware of ourselves and our despair, becomes no longer a despair of weakness and passivity, but an active despair, more like the devil's despair, a despair of defiance. Now, how does this actually occur? How do you get in the situation of despairingly wanting to be yourself? Well, what does that mean at all? How can wanting to be yourself be a situation of despair? Now, it's easier, I think I said earlier, at least for me, to understand how there's a despairing not wanting to be yourself, because you can't not be yourself, so it truly is a despairing, that is a hopeless situation. How can you hopelessly, despairingly want to be yourself? This is described in this section, which begins on page 98. Now, here Kierkegaard is assuming that the self has attained a certain degree of self-knowledge. So he says, in the last paragraph on page 98, first comes despair over the earthly, or something earthly, then despair over the eternal, over oneself. Then comes the defiance, which is really despair by means of the eternal, the despairing misuse of the eternal in the self to want in despair to be oneself. But just because it is despair by means of the eternal, it is in one sense very close to the truth. And just because it is very close to the truth, it is infinitely far away. The despair which is the corridor to faith, that is, having to go through all these negativities to get to the end point, which is certainly faith, is a corridor. You have to go through it to get there. You can't skip a step. Is also due to the help of the eternal. Through the eternal, the self has the courage to lose itself in order to win itself. Again, that's very biblical language, and that is the end point. But here, it will not begin by losing itself. It wants, on the contrary, to be itself. Now, to be itself defiantly, and to be itself despairingly. How do we get into such a situation? Well, why do we put ourselves in such a situation? Because certainly it's us putting ourselves in this situation. He says, in the second paragraph on page 99, in order to want in despair to be oneself, there must be consciousness of an infinite self. That is, consciousness that I am more than a body, that I have a soul, let's say. However, this infinite self is really only the most abstract form of the self, the most abstract possibility of the self. And it is this self the despair wants to be, severing the self from any relation to the power which has established it, or severing it from the conception that there is such a power. So here, the presence of God is aware, one becomes aware of that. That is, when we talk about defiance, there has to be something to defy, and certainly at this stage, the self is aware of something else beyond itself, and it has to be in order to be defiant of anything. How do we respond to this other? How do we respond, basically, to our awareness of being in the presence of God? He continues, by means of this infinite form, the self wants in despair to rule over himself, or create himself, make this self the self he wants to be, determine what he will have and what he will not have in his concrete self, that is, in his real self. His concrete self, or his concreteness, has indeed necessity and limits. Is this quite definite thing, with these aptitudes, predispositions, etc., in this concrete set of circumstances, etc.? But by means of the infinite form, the negative self, he wants first to undertake to refashion the whole thing in order to get out of it a self such as he wants, produced by means of the infinite form of the negative self. And it is in this way he wants to be himself. That is, I will make of myself the self that I want. That is, I rule over myself. I am autonomous. I give myself the law. I will make of myself what I want. That's the assertion and the defiance. That is to say, he wants to begin a little earlier than other people, not at and with the beginning, but in the beginning. He does not want to don his own self, does not want to have to wear his own self, does not want to see his task in his given self, that is, a self over which he doesn't have complete control. He wants, by virtue of being the infinite form, to construct it himself, that is, a form of self-assertion. That is, that we want to be the selves that we make, not necessarily the selves that we have been made.